The coin was cold in Luke Keene's palm, and he knew the moment he pressed it into the ticket agent's hand, there would be nothing left. Not a single cent to his name, not a dollar to buy a meal, not a copper to pay for a night's shelter. Just the worn leather of his gun belt, the horse outside that wasn't even truly his anymore, and the hollow ache of a man who had spent 32 years learning that survival meant holding tight to what little you had. But Louisa Collins was standing at that ticket window with tears cutting clean lines through the trail dust on her face, and her eyes held a desperation so raw, so violent in its honesty, that it reached inside Luke's chest and rearranged everything he thought he knew about himself. "Please," she was saying to the agent, her voice low and controlled in the way people got when they were barely keeping themselves from shattering completely. "I know it is only half the fare. I know that. But there has to be something you can do. I cannot stay in this town. You do not understand what happens to me if I stay in this town." The agent, a thin man with wire spectacles and the kind of expression that had been deadened by years of turning people away, shook his head with practiced indifference. "Rules are rules, miss. Half fare gets you half a ticket and half a ticket gets you nowhere. Next train leaves in 20 minutes, full fare or nothing." Luke watched her hands press flat against the counter. He watched her jaw tighten. He watched her close her eyes for a brief, terrible moment, like she was doing calculations in her head that kept coming up wrong. He had ridden into Denton, Texas on a Tuesday in October of 1883 with $73 and a reputation that traveled faster than he did. He had ridden out of 2 jobs, 1 bad deal, and a confrontation in Abilene that had left a scar on his left forearm, and a warrant with his name on it in 3 counties. He had exactly $1.12 to his name when he walked into the train station at Denton, because 72 of those dollars had been claimed by debts he owed to men who did not forget and did not forgive. The $1.12 was supposed to get him to San Antonio, where a man named Carter Briggs had promised him work that didn't require him to draw his gun. Legitimate work. The kind of work a man could do without looking over his shoulder every 10 minutes. But the fare to San Antonio was $1.12 exactly. He had counted it 3 times that morning, sitting on the edge of his cot in the cheapest room in Denton's only boarding house, letting the coins fall from one hand to the other. $1, 1 dime, 1 nickel, 2 pennies, exactly enough. And now here was Louisa Collins, and her trouble was written on her so plainly that even a man who had spent his whole life learning to look the other way could not pretend he didn't see it. He had seen her first 2 days ago, at the dry goods store on Main Street. She had been purchasing thread and a small tin of salt, and the man behind her in line had said something to her that made her go rigid from the crown of her head to the soles of her boots. She hadn't turned around. She hadn't said a word. She had simply paid her money and walked out with her head held at an angle that was either tremendous dignity or tremendous fear, and Luke had not been able to determine which. He had seen her again yesterday evening, walking quickly along the far side of the street with a basket over her arm, her eyes doing that particular kind of scanning that Luke recognized because he did it himself. The constant inventory of exits and threats. The way you moved when you were not safe. He had thought about her that night in a way that surprised him, not with the casual, forgettable interest a man might take in a pretty woman passing through, but with something heavier and more specific. He had wondered what her name was. He had wondered what she was running from. He had wondered if she was going to be all right. Those were not thoughts a man like Luke Keene usually allowed himself. And now she was at the ticket window, and she was 20 cents short, and the train left in 20 minutes, and Luke was standing close enough to hear every word. He did not think about it. That was the honest truth of it, the part he would turn over in his mind for months afterward. There was no weighing of options, no calculation of cost. His hand simply went to his pocket and his fingers closed around the coins and he stepped forward. "I have it," he said. Louisa Collins turned and he saw her face for the first time up close. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair pinned back under a blue bonnet that had seen better days and brown eyes that were sharp and intelligent even through the exhaustion and the fear. There was a bruise along her left cheekbone, fading to yellow at the edges. It was old enough to be healing. It was fresh enough to still matter. Something very old and very cold settled in Luke's chest at the sight of that bruise. "I do not know you," she said. There was no hostility in it. It was simply a fact stated plainly because she was a woman who could not afford to accept help without first understanding its price. "No," Luke agreed. "My name is Luke Keene. I am passing through." He looked at the ticket agent. "How much does she need?" 20 cents, the agent said. Luke placed the coins on the counter. He watched the agent count them. He watched the ticket get stamped and slid under the window. He watched Louisa Collins pick it up with hands that trembled only slightly. Then she turned to him fully, and her eyes moved over his face with an attention so careful and so deliberate that it felt almost like being touched. "That was everything you had, wasn't it?" she said. It was not quite a question. Luke thought about denying it. He was good at that, at keeping his face still, and his voice even while the truth of something moved beneath the surface like a river under ice. "I will manage," he said instead. The look she gave him then, the particular combination of gratitude and guilt, and something that was not quite either of those things, was the beginning of everything that came after. The train left in 19 minutes and Louisa Collins had her ticket, and Luke Keene was standing in the Denton train station in October of 1883 with empty pockets and a feeling in his chest he could not entirely name. She did not go to the platform. He watched her walk to the far end of the station's waiting area and sit down on a wooden bench, the ticket held in both hands. He watched her stare at it. He watched her lips move slightly, like she was having a conversation with herself that was coming to a difficult conclusion. He should have walked away. He had no money and nowhere particular to be, and the kind of past that made standing still in a public place a calculated risk. Every minute he spent in Denton was a minute that the warrant from Abilene had to find him. He crossed the station and sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a proper distance between them, because she was a woman who had been frightened and he understood that proximity to a stranger could feel like threat. "You should be on the platform," he said. "I know it," she said. "Train leaves in 18 minutes. "I am aware of that, Mr. Keene." He waited. She had something she needed to say, and he had learned that the worst thing you could do when someone was working toward a difficult truth was hurry them along. She turned the ticket over in her hands once, twice. Then she said, "I cannot simply let you stand there with nothing, not after what you did. I did not do very much. You gave up your last coin," she said. "Do not pretend that it was nothing because I was standing close enough to hear you count your change before you stepped up to that window." Luke felt something shift in his expression that he could not quite control. He looked down at his hands. "Where are you headed?" "San Antonio." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, because the universe apparently had a particular kind of humor. "What is amusing about that?" she asked, and there was a slight edge to it, a guardedness that told him she was accustomed to being the subject of amusement and did not appreciate it. "Nothing bad," he said quickly. "I was going to San Antonio myself. That is all." She studied him for a moment. "And now you cannot. And now I cannot." Louisa Collins was quiet for a long time. Outside the station windows, the train sat at the platform like a patient animal, steam curling up from its engine into the dry Texas air. The clock on the wall read 16 minutes to departure. "Tell me why you did it," she said. "Tell me honestly, because men do not simply give their last coin to a woman they have never met without a reason." Luke looked at her then directly for the first time since he had sat down. He looked at the bruise on her cheekbone. He looked at the way she held herself, spine straight, chin lifted, the posture of a person who had made a permanent decision to refuse to be diminished. "I saw your face when you were talking to the ticket agent," he said. "I have seen that kind of fear before. I know what it means when a person says they cannot stay somewhere." He paused. "I did not want to walk away from that and wonder what happened to you." The silence between them changed texture. It became something more careful, more considered. "What kind of life do you lead," she said slowly, "that you recognize that kind of fear on sight?" "Not a good one," he said honestly, "but not entirely bad either, just complicated." She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but there was something in the corner of her mouth that shifted toward it. "I am a widow," she said. "My husband died 8 months ago. He left debts I did not know about to men I did not know existed. One of those men has been making it very clear that he expects me to settle those debts in ways I am not willing to settle them." She paused, and he saw her jaw tighten again, that controlled tightening that he had noticed the first time he saw her. "My sister lives in San Antonio. I have been trying to save enough to get there for 3 months. Someone took the rest of my money this morning." "The man who is making things clear?" Luke asked. "His name is Dale Pryor," she said, and the name came out flat and hard like she was setting a stone down on a table. "He has a man working for him. They took my purse off the street this morning. They wanted to ensure I could not leave." Luke filed that name away. Dale Pryor. He had not heard it before, which meant Pryor's operation was local. That was both better and worse. 14 minutes, the ticket agent called out, with the detached helpfulness of a man who had been paid to remind people of schedules. Louisa stood. She looked down at Luke with an expression that was complicated and unguarded in a way that surprised him, given how carefully she had been guarding everything else. "I do not know how to thank you properly," she said. "I do not think there is a proper way." "You do not need to thank me," Luke said. He stood as well, because sitting while a woman stood in front of him was not something he had been raised to do regardless of how his subsequent years had gone. "You need to get on that train." She reached into the small bag she carried and produced something, pressing it into his hand before he could object. He looked down. It was a small folded piece of paper. "My sister's address in San Antonio," she said. "If you find yourself there and if you are in some kind of difficulty, she would want to help, because of what you did today." Luke looked at the address. He looked up at her. "Go," he said. "Before you miss it." She went. He watched her walk through the station doors and onto the platform, and he watched the blue bonnet disappear into the train car. And he stood there with a folded piece of paper in his empty hand, until the train pulled out of Denton station at 3:47 in the afternoon on that October Tuesday, taking Louisa Collins toward safety, and taking with it the last easy choice Luke Keene thought he would make for a very long time. He stood on the platform as the train became a line on the horizon and then nothing at all. And then he turned around and faced the town of Denton, Texas, with no money, no plan, and a name: Dale Pryor. The problem with being a man with a reputation in the Wild West was that reputation worked in both directions. It attracted trouble, certainly, but it also attracted work. Luke Keene's reputation was that he was fast and he was accurate, and he had never, in 12 years of a life that had taken him from Missouri to New Mexico and back again, fired at someone who hadn't fired first or made it absolutely clear they were about to. He was not a killer, though men with less careful vocabularies had called him that. He was a man who had survived, and survival in the world he inhabited had required a particular set of skills. He went to the saloon on Main Street, not because he wanted a drink he couldn't pay for, but because saloons were where information lived. He sat at the bar and asked the barman for water, because water was free and he was not going to pretend otherwise, and he listened. It took about 40 minutes for the name Dale Pryor to come up naturally in the conversation of the men around him. When it did, he listened more carefully. Pryor ran a lending operation out of a building on the east end of town that called itself a land office but wasn't. He had 6 men working for him. He had the local marshal in his pocket, which was how he operated so openly. He had been in Denton for about 4 years and had made himself, in that time, essentially untouchable. Luke thought about Louisa Collins on that train, getting further from Denton with every minute. He thought about the bruise on her cheekbone. He thought about a woman who had spent 3 months saving fair money that had then been taken from her on the street. He thought about the fact that he had no money and needed work, and that a man like Dale Pryor had a history of needing men with specific skills who would work for unclear purposes. It was not a clean plan. It was not the kind of plan a man with better options would pursue. But Luke had learned a long time ago that the absence of good options did not excuse a man from the responsibility of trying to do something right with whatever options remained. He went to Pryor's land office the next morning. The man himself was smaller than Luke had expected. He was perhaps 50, with a neat gray beard and clean clothes and the kind of careful, watchful stillness that meant he had been dangerous once, and was still sharp enough to know when he was in the presence of something that required his full attention. He looked at Luke with eyes the color of dried grass and said nothing for a long moment. "Luke Keene," Pryor said finally. "I know that name." "Most people in this part of Texas do," Luke said pleasantly. "You are the man who put down 3 of the Harley brothers in Abilene." "The Harley brothers put down themselves," Luke said. "They just used me to do it." Pryor's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "Sit down, Mr. Keene. I suspect we have something to discuss." What followed was a conversation that Luke navigated with the particular care of a man crossing a river on stepping stones that might or might not hold his weight. Pryor offered him work. Specifically, Pryor wanted a man of Luke's caliber visible around his operation, because there was a competing interest moving into the eastern side of Denton County, and visibility mattered. Luke agreed to nothing specific and let Pryor believe he was considering it. What he was actually doing was building a map in his head, the physical layout of Pryor's operation, the number of men, their habits and positions, the ledger books he could see on the shelf behind Pryor's desk. The fear he had seen on Louisa Collins' face multiplied, he suspected, across a dozen other faces in this town. He left with a handshake that committed him to returning the following morning with an answer, and he spent the rest of that day talking to people in Denton who were not Dale Pryor. He found the woman who ran the boarding house where Louisa had been staying. He found the man at the dry goods store who had watched Pryor's man take Louisa's purse that morning. He found 2 other women, both of them connected to men who had borrowed from Pryor and died or disappeared, who were now in situations not unlike the one Louisa had escaped. By nightfall, Luke Keene had a thorough picture of Dale Pryor's operation, and the picture was dark and ugly and specific in its harm. He also had, from the boarding house owner, a debt that Pryor was owed from a man named Collins, Louisa's husband. It was written down in a ledger copy the woman had somehow obtained. The debt was $40. The interest Pryor had added to it in the 8 months since Robert Collins had died had brought it to $230. Pryor had presented Louisa Collins with this figure 3 months ago and had then begun making clear what he expected in lieu of payment. Luke sat with this information in the dark of the stable where he was sleeping, because he could not afford a room, and he thought about what a man with no money and a complicated reputation and a folded piece of paper with an address on it ought to do. He thought about Louisa's face when she had said, "I cannot simply let you stand there with nothing." He thought about the way she had looked at him when she said, "You gave up your last coin. Do not pretend that it was nothing." Nobody had looked at Luke Keene quite like that in a very long time, like he was someone whose actions had weight, like what he chose to do mattered to somebody. In the morning, he did not go back to Pryor's land office. Instead, he went to the telegraph office and sent a message to a man in Austin named William Garrett, who was a Texas Ranger and who owed Luke Keene a considerable favor from an incident in 1879 that neither of them had ever spoken about publicly. Then he found the 2 women who were in debt to Pryor and told them what he was going to do. He asked them if they would be willing to testify to what they had experienced. The older of the 2, a woman named Margaret, looked at him for a long time and then said, "If you can guarantee that man does not walk away from it, then yes." "I cannot guarantee anything," Luke said honestly. "I can tell you that I am going to try." Margaret looked at him in a way that reminded him suddenly and unexpectedly of Louisa. That same careful, intelligent assessment. "All right," she said. The Texas Rangers arrived in Denton 3 days later, 4 of them, with William Garrett at their head. Garrett was a tall, sun-weathered man with a gray mustache and the kind of slow, deliberate manner that people consistently mistook for complacency until it was too late. He read the information Luke had compiled. He talked to Margaret and the other woman. He visited the marshal's office and had a conversation that lasted 45 minutes, after which the marshal developed a sudden and convenient illness that took him off duty. Pryor was arrested on a Thursday morning. His 6 men, seeing the Rangers, did the rational thing and surrendered without incident. The ledger books were seized. The fraudulent interest charges were documented. It was not the most dramatic resolution to a corrupt operation that Luke had ever witnessed, but it was thorough and it was legal, and it was the kind of thing that stuck. William Garrett found Luke afterward at the stable, where he was saddling his horse, because the stable owner had agreed to extend him credit in exchange for 2 days of fence mending on his property. "You could have done that yourself," Garrett said, nodding at the direction of the now-quiet land office. "Not legally," Luke said. "No," Garrett agreed. "Not legally." He was quiet for a moment. "There is work in San Antonio if you want it, legitimate work. My captain has been looking for someone with your particular skills who does not have a habit of acting outside the law." Luke thought about the folded piece of paper in his pocket. "I might be heading that way," he said. Getting to San Antonio without money required the particular combination of pride setting aside and practical problem-solving that Luke had become quite good at over the years. Garrett lent him $5 against future repayment. The stable owner, in a gesture of unexpected generosity, allowed him to work 2 more days in exchange for a sack of provisions and some grain for his horse. A woman at the church gave him a week-old loaf of bread because he had fixed her gate without being asked. It was, Luke reflected, not entirely unlike the way Louisa Collins had been trying to scrape together train fare for 3 months. The particular mathematics of survival when the margins were very tight. He rode south from Denton on a Friday morning, following the road toward Austin and then San Antonio, with the sun on his back and the dry Texas grassland spreading out around him in every direction. He rode without hurrying because his horse, a gray gelding named Trouble that he had owned for 6 years and considered the single most reliable presence in his life, had a tendency to go lame if pushed on uneven ground. He thought about Louisa Collins as he rode. He thought about this with the same honest self-examination that he applied to other things he wanted to understand clearly. He was not a man who was comfortable with self-deception. He had seen too many men destroy themselves by believing convenient lies about their own motivations. He had given her the last of his money because he had seen her face, and something in him had responded to what he saw there in a way that bypassed rational calculation. That was the truth. It was also true that he had not been able to stop thinking about her since. It was also true that he was riding toward San Antonio partly because of a job offer and partly because of an address on a folded piece of paper. He was 32 years old. He had spent those 32 years in a particular way, moving through the world as a solitary entity, forming no attachments that could be used against him, leaving before things became complicated. He understood himself well enough to know that this approach had served a practical purpose and had also cost him something he couldn't easily name. He rode for 4 days. On the first day he thought about the job. On the second day he thought about Louisa. On the third day he thought about the fact that she probably had someone in San Antonio, a whole life waiting to resume once she arrived safely at her sister's house, and that a woman who had survived what she had survived would have every reasonable cause to want nothing to do with a man who lived the way he lived. On the fourth day, he stopped thinking about it and simply rode. San Antonio in October of 1883 was a city in the particular state of transformation that Texas cities occupied in that decade, half frontier and half something that was reaching toward civic permanence. The streets near the plaza were broad and dusty, lined with adobe buildings and newer wooden structures that testified to recent ambition. There were telegraph wires now. There was a proper hotel. The river moved through the city center quietly, lined with cottonwoods that were just beginning to turn gold at the edges. Luke stabled Trouble at the livery near the plaza and found the address of William Garrett's contact at the ranger's office, a Captain James Harlow, who turned out to be a compact, direct man in his middle 40s who hired Luke within 20 minutes of meeting him. "I need a man who can work in the city and outside it," Harlow said. "Tracking, problem-solving, occasionally persuading people to do the right thing without resorting to methods that create additional problems. Garrett says you are that man." "I try to be," Luke said. "The pay is $40 a month to start," Harlow said. "You will need quarters." "I will manage that," Luke said. He left the ranger's office with a job, a 1-week advance on his salary, and the folded piece of paper, which he had taken out and looked at 3 times during the 4-day ride, and which was now somewhat creased from handling. He stood on the street in San Antonio and looked at the address. He had told himself that he would send a note first, something brief and proper, informing Louisa Collins that he had arrived in the city, and that he hoped she had made her journey safely, and that he wished her well in whatever came next. He had the note mostly composed in his head, and it was a sensible note, and he walked 4 blocks before he acknowledged that he was not going to send a note. He was going to go to that address, because he wanted to know that she was all right, and because the wanting had been building for 4 days and was not the sort of wanting that was going to be satisfied by a polite note. The address led him to a neighborhood of modest, well-kept houses on a street with 2 large live oak trees dropping their leaves into the dirt. The house itself was painted white with a green door, and there was a kitchen garden along one side that still had some late-season herbs in it. Luke stood at the gate for a long moment. Then the green door opened, and Louisa Collins stepped out onto the small porch with a basket of laundry, and she saw him, and she went very still. He watched something move through her expression in rapid sequence: surprise, wariness, recognition, and then something else entirely, something warm and complicated that she did not entirely manage to conceal before it moved through her. "Mr. Keene," she said. "Miss Collins," he said, because he didn't know what else she might be going by now that she was away from the circumstances of her marriage. "I apologize for arriving without notice. I wanted to make sure you arrived safely." She set the laundry basket down on the porch railing. She was wearing a different dress than she had been in Denton, pale green, and her hair was down around her shoulders, and the bruise on her cheekbone had faded almost entirely. She looked like herself rather than like a woman in extremity, and the difference was striking. "How did you get here?" she asked. "You had no money." "I worked my way down," he said, "and I have a position now with the Rangers." She came down from the porch and walked to the gate, stopping on her side of it. She was close enough that he could see the very specific way she was looking at him, with that same careful, complete attention she had given him in the train station. "You went after Pryor," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her. "Who told you?" "Margaret wrote to me," Louisa said. "She got my sister's address from the boarding house owner. She said a man named Luke Keene had brought the Texas Rangers down on Pryor's operation, and that he was arrested along with his men." She paused. "She also said you slept in a stable for 2 days because you had given away the last of your money." Luke felt something in his expression that he could not quite manage back into neutrality. "I had options," he said. "It was not as dramatic as it sounds." "Come inside," Louisa said, and opened the gate. Her sister's name was Clara, and she was 2 years younger than Louisa, with lighter hair and a more open manner, and she shook Luke's hand when they were introduced with the directness of a woman who had been told something important about him and was making her own determination. She gave him coffee and bread without being asked, and then, with a tact that Luke appreciated deeply, found somewhere else to be. Louisa sat across from him at the kitchen table, and he drank his coffee, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had been through something together, even briefly, and were now trying to figure out what the shape of the next thing was. "Tell me about Dale Pryor," she said. "Tell me everything." He did. He told her about the ledger and the false interest and the two women and William Garrett and the four Rangers and the Thursday morning arrest. He told it plainly without embellishment, and she listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on his face, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. "Those other women," she said. "Margaret and the other one." "Margaret Haynes," he said, "and a woman named Ruth Cole. Will they be all right?" "Ledger is being reviewed by a court," he said. "The fraudulent debts should be dismissed. It will take time, but yes, I believe they will be all right." Louisa nodded, and he watched something settle in her, a weight releasing. "Good," she said softly. "That is good." He should have left then. He had confirmed that she was safe. He had told her what had happened. The purpose of the visit was accomplished, and a man of good sense would have finished his coffee and expressed his good wishes and gone to find his quarters. "Tell me about yourself," he said instead. She looked at him, he looked back. Something in the air of the kitchen shifted in a way that was not accounted for by the mere fact of two people sitting in a room. She told him. She told him about growing up in Georgia, the youngest daughter of a school teacher, the first person in her family to make it past the Mississippi when she had followed Robert Collins to Texas in 1878, believing in a life that had not quite materialized as promised. She told him about the years of trying to make something work with a man who was kind enough, but always in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. She told him about Robert's death from a fever in February, and the morning 3 weeks later when Dale Pryor had knocked on her door with a ledger and a number. She told it without self-pity, which Luke found he had expected, given what he had observed of her character. She told it with the matter-of-fact clarity of a woman who had been forced to become very clear-eyed about her own circumstances. "Now you," she said, when she had finished. Luke was quiet for a moment. He told people about himself in carefully calibrated measures, giving enough to seem open, and keeping the rest back behind a line that most people never noticed because they stopped pushing before they reached it. Louisa Collins, he suspected, would notice the line if he drew it. He told her about Missouri, about a father who had been a decent enough man until he wasn't, about leaving at 17 with nothing much to recommend him, except an unusual natural steadiness of hand and eye that had turned out to be useful in the particular world of the 1870s American West. He told her about Abilene and what had happened there, which he had not told very many people, the whole of it rather than the version that the warrant described, because the warrant described only the outcome and not the reasons. He told her about the 12 years of moving and the reputation that preceded him everywhere he went, and the job offer from Captain Harlow that morning. He did not tell her everything, but he told her more than he had told anyone in a very long time, and the telling felt, in a way he could not quite account for, like setting down something he had been carrying. She listened to all of it in the same way she had listened to the account of Pryor's arrest, completely and with her full attention, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually absorbing what he was saying. When he finished, she said, "Do you want to stop moving?" It was such a direct question, so perfectly targeted at the thing he had been circling around without naming, that for a moment he simply looked at her. "I think I do," he said. "I'm not sure I know how." She nodded like that was a sensible answer. "I think," she said, "that the wanting is probably the most important part. The how tends to follow." He left that afternoon with his head full of her and came back the next day, and the day after that. He told himself each time that it was the coffee and the conversation and the reasonable pleasure of having found someone worth talking to in a new city. He told himself this for about a week before he stopped telling himself anything and simply acknowledged the truth of it. He was in love with her. It was not a dramatic revelation. It arrived quietly and with a feeling of deep, almost exasperated recognition, like something he should have known already and had simply been slow to acknowledge. The question was what to do about it, given who he was and how he had lived, and the fact that Louisa Collins had already had one life in Texas that had not gone as planned and deserved to be very careful about what she agreed to next. He was careful with her. He was attentive and present and honest, but he was also respectful of the particular vulnerability of a woman who had been through what she had been through, and he moved slowly because she deserved to be moved toward slowly. He brought her small things when he came: a book from the lending library on Commerce Street, wild persimmons he had found on a ride outside the city, a block of proper Virginia tobacco for Clara's husband James, who had come home in the evenings to find Luke Keene at his kitchen table with increasing frequency, and had responded to this situation with admirable equanimity. Louisa came to watch him work one afternoon in November, when he had to deliver papers to a property east of the city, and Harlow had said he could bring a guest if she stayed well back from anything that might be complicated. Nothing was complicated. It was a quiet ride, and she rode well, which he had not known but which surprised him pleasantly, and they talked about Georgia and Missouri and the particular quality of light on the Texas hill country in the autumn. On the way back she said, "You are different when you are working." "How so?" he asked. "More contained," she said. "More careful, but not cold, just focused." She considered. "I think you would be very good to have with you in a difficult situation." "You have already had me in a difficult situation," he said. "In Denton." "Yes," she said, "and you were very good." A pause. "That is part of why I keep letting you come to dinner." He looked at her. She was watching the road ahead, but there was something in the set of her mouth that was very close to teasing. "Only part," he said. She glanced at him sideways, and there it was, the real smile, the one he had been working toward for weeks, open and warm and entirely unguarded. "Only part," she confirmed. He was going to say something else, something that he was arranging carefully in his head, but his horse chose that moment to find a gopher hole in the road and stumble slightly, requiring his full attention, and by the time they were moving smoothly again the moment had shifted, and Louisa was talking about something Clara had said that morning, and he let it go. But he carried that sideways glance and that smile for the rest of the day like a coin in his pocket. December came, bringing a cold that was mild by Missouri standards, but that Clara declared intolerable and James bore with stoic Texas resignation. Louisa had taken a position as a clerk at a milliner's shop on Commerce Street, having determined that depending entirely on her sister's hospitality was not a situation she intended to maintain past the absolute necessary minimum. She was saving money with an efficiency that Luke recognized and respected, the same careful mathematics she had applied to the train fare, now directed toward the goal of her own room somewhere. Luke had found his own quarters, a single room above a saddle-maker's shop near the plaza, modest and functional, and belonging to him for the first time in years, rather than being rented by the night. He had bought a small iron stove for it, and a good chair, and a shelf for the books he was beginning to accumulate, because now that he was staying somewhere long enough to accumulate things, he found that books were what he wanted to accumulate. He was walking Louisa home from the milliner's one December evening, which had become a habit that neither of them had explicitly arranged, but that both of them clearly intended to continue, when they passed the small church on Navarro Street that had been decorated for the Christmas season with a wreath on the door and candles in every window. "My mother loved Christmas," Louisa said, looking at the candles. "Mine too," Luke said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and in the candlelight from the church windows her face was very clear and very close, and he made a decision. "Louisa," he said. She went still, reading something in his voice. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you are willing, if that is something you want." He paused. "I am not the most straightforward man to know. I have a past that is complicated, a reputation that is not always accurate but is also not entirely wrong, and a way of life that I am still in the process of changing. But I am not going anywhere, and I mean that specifically. I am staying in San Antonio. I have a good position and I am building something real here." He stopped. "I think you are remarkable, and I have thought so since the train station in Denton, and I wanted to say that out loud before I spent any more evenings at your sister's table pretending it was just the coffee." Louisa Collins looked at him for a long time in the candlelight from the church windows on Navarro Street. "It was never just the coffee," she said. He reached out and took her hand, which was gloved against the December chill, and she let him hold it, and they stood there for a moment in front of the church while the candles burned and the cold air moved around them. "Then yes," she said, "I am willing." What followed was the particular, serious, tender process of two people who had both been through difficulty learning to trust toward each other. It was not always easy. Louisa had nights when something would catch her off guard, a tone of voice, a shadow in a doorway, the particular way someone stood, and she would go very quiet and very still in a way that Luke recognized now and understood how to be present for without pressing. He did not push her to explain what she was feeling, and did not make her feel like she owed him an account of her own reactions. She, in return, asked him questions that other people had not thought to ask, or had thought to ask, and then retreated from when they sensed the line approaching. She asked him about the man in Abilene, about what had happened specifically and what it had cost him. She asked him about the years of moving, whether there was something he had been running from or whether it was more that he had simply never found a reason to stop. She asked him whether he missed it, the freedom of it, the particular kind of person you got to be when you had no fixed address and no one who knew your face. He answered all of it honestly, because she deserved honest answers, and because he found, to his own surprise, that he wanted to answer. The questions felt like someone clearing debris from a road, making room for something to move forward. Christmas that year was spent at Clara and James's house, with a proper goose that James had somehow obtained, and James's sister and her husband who came over from Bexar, and a decorated tree in the corner of the parlor. Luke sat at a table full of people who were in various degrees of connection to Louisa, and he ate good food and drank from the bottle of rye that James produced for the occasion, and he watched Louisa across the table laugh at something her niece said, and the feeling in his chest was so complete and so warm that it almost frightened him with its intensity. She caught him looking and held his gaze for a moment, and whatever she saw in his face made her smile in that particular way she had, the real one, the open one, and then look away. James caught Luke's eye from the other end of the table and raised his glass slightly in a gesture that was partly salute and partly something more pointed, and Luke raised his glass back. In January, he had a difficult 2 weeks. A case he was working for Harlow went badly in a way that was not his fault, but that resulted in a man being injured, and the weight of that sat on him heavily in a way that he had not expected, because he had spent years in situations where things went badly and had learned to carry it without showing the strain. He showed it now, because Louisa was there, and showing it to her felt like something different from showing weakness. It felt like sharing the weight of something real. She came to his rooms above the saddle maker's shop for the first time on the evening of the second bad week, because he had not come to dinner in 3 days, and she had sent Clara's boy with a note that said simply, "I am coming over at 6 o'clock unless you send word that you do not want company." He had not sent word. She brought food and sat with him while he ate, and then she told him about the worst week she had ever had, which was the week after Robert died, when she had understood the full dimension of the debts and the full isolation of her situation, and she had not been sure she was going to manage it. "But I did manage it," she said. "Not gracefully, not without some very undignified crying in the kitchen in the middle of the night, but I managed it." "You are the least fragile person I know," he said. "Everyone is fragile sometimes," she said. "That is not the same as being breakable." He looked at her, sitting across from him in his modest room with its small stove and its shelf of books, her coat still on because the room took a while to warm up, her face serious and attentive in the lamplight. "I think," he said carefully, "that I love you." He watched her absorb this. He watched the careful, deliberate way she processed it, the same way she processed everything important. "I know you do," she said. "I have known for a while," a pause. "I think I love you too. I have been slower to say it because I wanted to be certain I was saying it for the right reasons and not because I am grateful or because you are safe or because I am tired of being afraid." "And are you certain?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You are infuriating sometimes because you keep things behind a wall that you have to knock down brick by brick, and you have a tendency to solve problems alone when there are people who would help you if you asked. And I love you anyway. Actually, I suspect I love you partly because of those things and partly in spite of them, which is probably what loving a real person rather than an idea of a person feels like." Luke was quiet for a moment. "Nobody has ever said anything like that to me before," he said. "Like what?" "Like they see me specifically," he said. "The actual version, not the reputation or the story or the idea of a man who is useful to have around." She reached across the small table and put her hand over his. "I see you specifically," she said. "Luke Keene, the man who gave his last coin to a woman he didn't know because he couldn't walk away from that kind of fear. The man who then, when he could have simply ridden to the next place, stayed and put things right." She paused. "That is who I love, the specific person." He turned his hand over under hers and held it. Outside, San Antonio went on doing what cities did at 7 in the evening in January. Horses and voices and the distant sound of music from somewhere near the plaza. And inside the small room above the saddlemaker's shop, something settled into place that felt, to Luke Keene, like something he had not known he was waiting for. He proposed to her in February, on a Sunday afternoon when they had walked along the river, and the cottonwoods were bare and silver against a pale sky. He did not have a ring yet, because his savings were only beginning to recover their depth, and he said this honestly along with everything else he said, which was that he wanted to marry her and stay in San Antonio and build a life that was rooted and real, and that he understood if she needed time to think because he was asking her to trust in something that was still in the process of becoming. She said yes immediately with a certainty that was almost startling in its completeness, and then said, "I do not need a ring to know what I am agreeing to." "You will have one," he said, "when I can do it properly." "I know I will," she said. "That is the thing about you. You always do what you say you are going to do." He had the ring by March. It was a simple gold band with a small garnet, because garnets were what he could afford, and the jeweler on Commerce Street said that garnets were the color of good fortune in the old Spanish tradition, and Luke decided he was willing to believe that. He gave it to her on a Sunday evening at Clara and James's table, with Clara openly weeping and James offering congratulations with his customary quiet warmth. The wedding was small and held at the church on Navarro Street in April, on a clear morning, with the live oaks coming into their spring leaf, and the air smelling of flowers from someone's garden along the block. Clara served as Louisa's witness, and William Garrett, who happened to be in San Antonio that week on business, served as Luke's, which Garrett managed with the same composed, unhurried manner he brought to everything. Luke stood at the front of that small church and watched Louisa come down the aisle on James's arm, because there was no one else for that purpose, and she was wearing a dress of deep blue that she and Clara had made together, and the garnet ring was on her hand, and her face was the face of someone who had arrived somewhere they had been working toward for a very long time. The minister said the words. Luke and Louisa said theirs. He put his hand over hers and felt the ring he had given her beneath his fingers, and when it was done, she looked up at him with those brown eyes that had been seeing him specifically for 7 months, and he understood, with absolute completeness, that this was the thing he had been moving toward his whole life without knowing it. The reception was at Clara and James's house, with more food than Luke had expected given the modest scale of the preparations, because it turned out that Clara had been planning this particular party since approximately January and had simply not told anyone. There were people from the neighborhood and people from the milliners in Harlow, and two of the rangers from the office and the saddle maker from below Luke's old room, who came with his wife and a wedding gift of leather-bound journals, one for each of them, which turned out to be the most thoughtful gift of the day. They moved into rooms of their own that had been taken by the week in advance of the wedding, and were now theirs by the month. 3 rooms above a respectable dry goods store on a street with trees, with a view of a walled garden below, and enough space for both their things and the things they were beginning to accumulate together. Luke hung his gun belt on the hook beside the door each evening when he came home, and coming home was the part of the day he thought about from the moment he arrived at the ranger's office in the morning. Not in an anxious way. In the warm, anticipatory way of a man who has understood for the first time what it means to be going somewhere rather than simply going. Summer in San Antonio was a heat that even Luke, who had spent many summers in Texas, had to acknowledge was serious. They spent evenings on the small balcony above the dry goods store with glasses of water and the kind of conversation that moved easily from the practical to the philosophical and back, because they were two people who had read a great deal and thought carefully about things, and were now, for the first time in both their lives, doing that thinking with someone who was fully present and fully engaged. Louisa had kept the position at the milliners through the spring, but by summer she had been offered a role helping to manage the accounts, which was more suited to her skills and paid better, and she had taken it with the same no-nonsense efficiency she brought to most things. In August she told him she was expecting a baby. She told him in the kitchen after dinner directly, because that was how she did things, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression he suspected was not entirely composed, and then stood up and crossed to where she was standing and held her the way he had wanted to hold her from very early on, completely and without reservation. "Are you all right?" he said against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "Are you?" He thought about this honestly. "I am terrified," he said, "and very glad. Both of those things are true at the same time." She laughed, and he felt the warmth of it through him. "I think that is probably the correct response," she said. "The baby was born in April of 1885, a boy, which surprised Luke in a way that he acknowledged was not rational, because there had been an equal chance of either, and he should not have had a strong expectation. But there was something particular about holding a son that connected to parts of himself he had thought were perhaps irreparably damaged by the distance between himself and his own father, and he held the baby carefully for a very long time while Louisa slept, exhausted and safe in their bed, and he had one of the more honest conversations of his life, conducted in his own head, about the kind of father he intended to be. They named him Thomas James Keene, Thomas for Luke's grandfather who had been the steadiest presence of his early childhood, and James for Louisa's brother-in-law who had never been anything but kind. Thomas James turned out to be a child with his mother's eyes and his father's tendency toward focused silence, and he went everywhere his parents went from the time he could be carried, strapped to Louisa's back in the fashion she had learned from a woman at the market, regarding the world with enormous brown eyes and a seriousness that made people who met him smile. William Garrett came through San Antonio twice a year and always spent an evening at their table. He had, somewhere in that first year, gone from a man Luke owed a favor to a man Luke considered something close to a friend, which was a category Luke had not had much experience with. Margaret Haynes wrote from Denton twice, once to report the successful dismissal of her fraudulent debt, and once to announce her own marriage to a man who worked at the livery, and both letters made Louisa read them twice and fold them carefully before putting them away in the tin box where she kept important papers. Luke had a scar on his left forearm from Abilene, and sometimes on cold mornings it ached in a way that reminded him of everything that preceded the version of himself that now existed. He did not mind the reminder. It was useful to remember where you had come from, as long as you were clear about the distinction between where you had come from and where you were going. He was promoted in 1886 to a senior position with the Rangers' San Antonio division, which came with a small increase in pay and a significant increase in the complexity of the work. And he took to it with a thoroughness that Harlow found gratifying, and that Luke found genuinely satisfying in a way that the old work, the moving and the gunfighting and the surviving, had never been. This work meant something that he could explain in plain terms to his wife and eventually to his son. It was an uncomplicated meaning, something Luke had not had for most of his life. He had, at some point during this period, stopped thinking of himself as a man who was in the process of becoming something else and started simply being the thing he had become. It was a subtle shift, but Louisa noticed it. "You are different," she said one evening, in the way she had of naming things he had not yet named himself. "How so?" he asked, which was the question he always asked in response to that particular opener. "More settled," she said. "Not less yourself. More yourself, actually. Like the version of you that was always there but that kept getting covered over by the circumstances of your life." She paused. "I like this version. I like the other ones too, but I like this one very much." He reached over and pulled her close to him on the settle they had acquired the previous year, and she tucked herself against his side in the easy, habitual way of a person who has found exactly the right position, and they sat like that in the lamplight while Thomas slept in the next room and the city moved quietly outside. Thomas was walking by 14 months and talking with great determination by 18, and by the time he was 2, he had the vocabulary of a child considerably older, which both his parents found entirely unsurprising, and which his Aunt Clara declared remarkable on a regular basis. Clara and James remained close, in the easy, affectionate way of a family that actually liked each other rather than simply tolerating proximity. Sunday dinners rotated between the two households, with an informality that suited everyone. Clara had her first child, a girl, in 1886, and Thomas regarded his cousin Eliza with the protective seriousness of a much older child, which delighted everyone and occasionally hampered Eliza's perfectly reasonable desire to do things without supervision. In 1887, there was a difficult case. Luke would not speak about the specifics with Louisa, because there were parts of the work he protected her from as a matter of consistent practice, but she understood enough to know that it had involved someone being hurt who should not have been, and that the outcome, while ultimately correct, had costs attached to it. She had learned, by this point, his particular patterns of withdrawal and what they meant and what they did not mean, and she had learned that the most effective thing she could do was be present without pressing, which was exactly what he had done for her in her own difficult passages. He came back from 3 days of that careful silence and found her at the kitchen table with Thomas in her lap, both of them looking at illustrations in a natural history book that she had borrowed from the lending library. And she looked up when he came in, and her face did that thing it always did, the thing he would never be able to describe precisely, but that meant she was genuinely glad he was there. And he sat down at the table with them, and Thomas immediately climbed from her lap to his with the certainty of a child who knows exactly where he belongs, and Luke put his arms around his son and looked across the table at his wife. "All right," she said. "Getting there," he said. She nodded. She passed the natural history book across the table, open to a page with drawings of migratory birds. Thomas pointed at one with great authority and said something about its coloring that was more accurate than not, and Louisa met Luke's eyes over the top of his head, and they shared one of those looks that existed between people who had made something together and knew what it had cost and were glad of the cost. In the fall of 1887, Louisa told him she was expecting again. "Are you all right?" he said, which was the first thing he always said because she was the first thing he always considered. "Very well," she said. "Are you?" "I am extremely glad," he said, this time without the terrified component, because he knew more now and the fear had given way to something that was almost purely forward-facing. The second baby came in June of 1888, another boy, which Louisa greeted with a cheerful equanimity that made Luke love her even more than he already did. They named him Daniel Robert, the Robert for her late husband, in the straightforward, uncomplicated way of a woman who could honor a person's life without being defined by their failures. Daniel Robert was different from Thomas in every outward way, louder and more immediately sociable, and inclined to grin at strangers from his earliest weeks. And watching Thomas navigate the arrival of this different kind of person in his life was one of the ongoing sources of genuine entertainment in the Keene household. Thomas had been an only child for 3 years and had opinions about the new arrangement, which he expressed with the precise vocabulary of a child who had been spoken to like a small adult for his entire life. "He requires a great deal of attention," Thomas said one evening, regarding his brother with a look that was equal parts exasperation and something that was clearly, despite itself, the beginning of affection. "Most people do," Louisa said. "You and father do not require that much attention," Thomas said. "We did when we were his age," Luke said. "I promise you." Thomas considered this and then, apparently finding it plausible, returned to his book. Luke's mother, who was still living in Missouri, learned of her son's marriage and children through the careful, occasional letters he had been sending since his arrival in San Antonio, and responded to each update with letters that grew warmer as they accumulated. In 1889 she made the journey to San Antonio, which at 62 was not a small undertaking, and stayed for 3 weeks in the bedroom that had been set up for guests, and she and Louisa took to each other with an immediate warmth that Luke found moving in a way he had not anticipated. "She is exactly right for you," his mother said to him privately, one afternoon while Louisa was at the milliner's and the boys were napping. "I know it," Luke said. "You are happy," his mother said. It was an observation, delivered with the particular weight of a woman who had been uncertain for many years that happiness was a destination her son was ever going to reach. "Yes," Luke said, "I am." She squeezed his hand and did not say anything else, because she was a woman who understood that some things were best left in the space where they were perfectly understood. The Texas that Luke and Louisa inhabited in these years was a state in active transformation. The cattle drives were contracting as the railroads expanded, and barbed wire changed the open range into something different. The frontier was compressing, the particular wildness of it being replaced, unevenly and not always cleanly, by the structures of civic life. There were injustices in this transformation that Luke saw clearly, and that he and Louisa spoke about with the directness they brought to all things that mattered. The treatment of the Mexican and Tejano communities in San Antonio, dispossessed in ways that the law technically sanctioned but that were plainly and specifically unjust. The continued pressure on the Comanche and Kiowa people of the territory, pushed into diminishing and unfair arrangements by the same government structures that employed Luke. These were not simple things to navigate for a man working within the Rangers, an institution that had its own complicated history with justice and injustice. Luke navigated them with the same careful, specific attention he brought to everything, doing what he could within the scope of his work to apply the law with consistency rather than convenience, refusing cases that felt like the law being used as a tool for dispossession rather than protection, building over time a modest but real reputation for fairness that was different from his older reputation, and that he valued considerably more. Louisa, who had been reading and thinking about these things her whole adult life, was consistently the sharper analyst of the two of them on these questions, and their conversations about the state of the world they lived in were among the most engaged and serious they had. She had taken, by this point, to writing articles for the San Antonio Express on women's topics and labor questions, a development that had surprised exactly no one who knew her, and that had given her a public voice that she used with the same economy and precision she applied to everything else. Thomas went to school in the fall of 1890 at 5 years old, and proceeded to astonish his teacher within the first week by reading at a level 3 years beyond his age and asking questions that she reported to Louisa as both remarkable and occasionally destabilizing to her lesson plans. "I apologize if he is difficult," Louisa said at the first parents' meeting. "He is not difficult," the teacher, a young woman named Miss Porter, said. "He is extraordinary. I simply need to think harder about what I am teaching him." Daniel, who would start school 2 years after Thomas, showed every sign of being equally extraordinary in entirely different directions, primarily social and kinetic ones, and Luke had already begun quietly reinforcing the furniture in the most trafficked rooms of their home. In 1891, Luke was offered a captain's position that would have required them to relocate to Austin. He and Louisa discussed it at length over several evenings, with the full, honest engagement they brought to all major decisions. "Do you want it?" she asked. "I want to know if you would be willing to move," he said, which was not quite the same question but was the one he actually needed answered first. "I am asking what you want," she said. "I can have an opinion about the move after I know whether the move is something you actually want to do." He thought about it honestly. "I think I would be good at it," he said. "I think the position matters, but San Antonio is home now and I am not certain that Austin would become home in the same way." Louisa was quiet for a moment. "Then tell them no," she said. "Not because of me, because that is the right answer for you. Are you certain?" "Luke," she said, with the particular tone she used when she was about to be extremely direct, "I spent 8 months in Denton, Texas trying to get to San Antonio, and I got here, and I built something here that I did not imagine I would have again. I am certain. Stay." He stayed. He wrote back to Austin with a polite refusal and went to work the following Monday with the feeling of a man who has chosen correctly and knows it. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because no life is without difficulty, and the specific difficulties of the world they lived in, the hardships of the frontier economy, the droughts that hit the cattle country in the early 1890s, the labor unrest, and the political upheavals of a nation in the middle of figuring out what it wanted to be. All of these touched their life in ways both direct and indirect. But they moved through difficulty the way they moved through everything, together and with clear eyes and with the particular strength that came from being absolutely certain of what you were trying to protect. Thomas, at 8, had become an avid reader of natural history and was determined to be a scientist when he grew up, a determination that his parents supported completely, while privately finding it remarkable that a man who had grown up moving from town to town had produced a child with such organized intellectual ambitions. Daniel, at 6, was primarily interested in horses, and Luke had begun taking him out to the stable to help with Trouble, who was old now and much gentler than he had been in his young and difficult years. And watching Daniel move around that old horse with absolute unfrightened confidence was one of the things Luke found himself storing carefully in memory. In the spring of 1892, Louisa told him she was expecting their third child. "Are you all right?" he said. "Extremely well," she said, with a smile that was warm and certain. "Are you?" "Very glad," he said, completely and without qualification. The third baby came in November, a girl this time, with Luke's lighter coloring and Louisa's exactitude of expression, and they named her Margaret Eliza, Margaret for Margaret Haynes in Denton, who was doing well by all reports, and Eliza for her cousin who she would grow up alongside. Margaret came into the world with an opinion about it that was immediately apparent, and that she maintained consistently through every subsequent observation of her character. Thomas regarded his baby sister with the solemn seriousness that had characterized his regard for Daniel, and then, within the first 2 weeks, was completely and irrevocably devoted to her. Daniel, who had adjusted to being the middle child with better grace than anyone had expected, declared her very small but acceptable. Luke held his daughter on the evening of the third day, sitting in the chair by the window while Louisa rested, and he looked at this new person who had his mother's chin and the deep attentive eyes that all 3 of his children had, and he thought about a Tuesday in October of 1883 in the Denton train station, and a moment so small and so complete that it had altered everything that came after. One coin. One decision made in the space of a breath, without calculation, without thought for what it cost. He had given away the last thing he had, and somehow, in the particular mysterious mathematics of how things worked out, he had ended up with more than he had ever known how to want. He put his finger against his daughter's tiny hand and felt her fingers close around it with a grip that was surprisingly certain for something so small. And he stayed very still in the lamplight of the room that was his, in the house that was his and Louisa's, in the city that was home, listening to his wife breathe softly in the next room, and the distant sounds of San Antonio at evening, the bells of the church on Navarro Street counting out the hour. Louisa appeared in the doorway in her dressing gown, her dark hair down around her shoulders, looking at him with Margaret in his arms. "She's sleeping," Louisa asked softly. "Nearly," he said. She came across the room and sat on the arm of the chair beside him, leaning against his shoulder, looking down at their daughter. He shifted Margaret to one arm and put the other around Louisa. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Denton," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "The train station." "Yes." She turned her head slightly to look at him. In the lamplight her face was exactly as he had first truly seen it, sharp and intelligent and honest, with those brown eyes that saw him specifically. "I think about it sometimes too," she said. "About how close it came to going differently. If the train had been early, if you had been at the other end of the station. If you had chosen not to step forward." She paused. "I try not to think about it too carefully because it frightens me a little, how contingent it all was." "One coin," he said. "One coin," she agreed. Margaret made a small sound and settled deeper into sleep, and Luke tightened his arm around Louisa and she settled her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that while the church bells finished their count and the city went quietly about its business outside. He had come into Denton with $1.12, and a reputation, and 12 years of surviving and nothing else of any particular weight. He had stood in that train station with his last coin in his hand and looked at a woman's face and made a choice that was not reasonable but was exactly right. He was 32 then, and the world had been very large and very uncertain, and he had been very alone in it in a way that he had grown so accustomed to that he had almost stopped noticing. He was 40 now, and the world was still large and still uncertain, but it was inhabited, fully and specifically, by a woman who loved him in the particular seeing way she had, and 3 children who were building their own approaches to the world out of the materials that their parents and their time and their place had given them, and a home that was real and rooted and full of books, and the smell of coffee in the morning and the sound of voices he knew as well as he knew anything. There were still difficult cases. There were still mornings when the scar on his left forearm ached in the cold, and he remembered things he would rather not. There were still injustices in the world he occupied that he could not fix, only push against, and the pushing was wearing and sometimes discouraging. But there was this lamplight, and a child sleeping in his arms and a woman's head on his shoulder, and the particular fullness of a life that had been built from a single, unreasonable, completely correct decision. "Go to sleep," he said quietly, because Louisa's breathing had gone slow and heavy in the way it did when exhaustion caught up with her. "I am not sleeping," she murmured. "I am resting my eyes." "Of course you are," he said. He sat with his sleeping daughter and his almost sleeping wife in the lamplight until the candle burned low, and then he carried Margaret to her cradle with the careful, practiced ease of a man who had done this twice before. And he settled Louisa into bed and tucked the quilt around her, and stood for a moment looking at them, his wife and his daughter in the gentle dark of the room. Then he went to check on the boys. Thomas in his bed, with a book beside him, and Daniel sprawled in his particular way that occupied all available space as a matter of principle. Then he came back to bed and lay beside Louisa in the dark, and she reached out in her sleep and put her hand over his on the quilt, and he turned his palm up under hers the way he had that first evening outside the church on Navarro Street. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. He closed his eyes. The last thought he had before sleep was of a train platform in October, and a woman's face, and a coin that had been cold in his palm, and had turned out to be the most important thing he had ever spent.